Hollywood loves to act like it invented space battles, mutant horrors, and futuristic gadgets. But what if the most daring ideas came from somewhere else, long before the blockbusters rolled in? Japan was already exploring cosmic terror and wild science fiction decades earlier. These films didn't just tell stories, they planted seeds that Hollywood later harvested. Curious which forgotten gems rewired the imagination of global cinema? Let's dive in, because these visions deserve the spotlight. Warning from Space 1956. The first Japanese color sci-fi was not about giant monsters, it was about aliens shaped like starfish. Warning from Space may look campy today, but in 1956, it was nothing short of groundbreaking. Directed by Koji Shima, the film introduced audiences to star-shaped visitors who arrive on Earth with an urgent message: our planet is in danger of colliding with a rogue celestial body. That's right. The apocalypse was brewing long before Armageddon or Deep Impact made Hollywood cash in on end-of-the-world panic. The aliens, called Parents, aren't here to conquer. They're here to warn. What makes the movie so interesting is how it balances spectacle with paranoia. The visuals were colorful and surreal. Giant glowing eyes, staring at humanity from bodies shaped like sea creatures. At first, people laughed them off, doubting their intentions. But when disaster looms, the message becomes clear. Sometimes the strangest outsiders are the only ones trying to save us. You can trace this DNA straight into Hollywood blockbusters. Independence Day, Contact, even Arrival share the same blueprint of aliens as messengers rather than monsters. The themes of mistrust, global unity, and science stepping up to save the day were already being explored in Warning from Space. And let's not forget, this was released just a decade after Hiroshima, when fears of annihilation were very real in Japan. That adds an extra layer of meaning. This wasn't just pulp entertainment, it was a cultural echo of survival anxiety. Today, many viewers see it as camp, with those odd costumes and melodramatic dialogue. But beneath the surface is a serious question. Can humanity listen before it's too late? Hollywood eventually dressed up the same story with sleek effects, but Japan told it first in bold colors and strange shapes. Warning from Space wasn't just early sci-fi, it was a cosmic warning wrapped in starfish suits, and Hollywood never stopped listening. The Mysterians, 1957. When it comes to alien invasions, The Mysterians deserves more credit than it gets. Released in 1957 and directed by Ishiro Honda, the same creative mind behind Godzilla, this film wasn't about stomping monsters, but about brainy invaders in dazzling helmets who wanted more than just Earth's land. They wanted resources and influence. Sound familiar? It should, because decades of Hollywood alien blockbusters borrowed this exact setup. The story is simple, yet bold. A mysterious dome rises from the ground, and inside dwell the Mysterians, an alien race who claim they only want a piece of land and a peaceful coexistence. Of course, they're hiding bigger plans, and soon their massive ray guns and towering machines unleash chaos. The visuals were jaw-dropping for the time. Miniature cities were reduced to rubble, futuristic weapons lit up the skies, and the Mysterians themselves looked both regal and unsettling with their bright, insect-like helmets. What set this film apart was its combination of sci-fi and Cold War politics. Released during an era of global unease, the aliens weren't just outsiders, they were metaphors for powers demanding control, treaties, and territory. The idea that peace talks could be a mask for domination was chillingly timely. And in pure cinema terms, this film pioneered many tropes. From Star Wars to Independence Day, the echoes of the Mysterians are everywhere. Just look at how George Lucas built the Galactic Senate, or how countless sci-fi films showcase advanced civilizations demanding compliance from Earth. Honda laid the groundwork here. Critics at the time dismissed it as flashy spectacle, but the visuals were ahead of the curve. It gave Japanese studios the chance to experiment with scale, creating shots that later influenced not only kaiju cinema, but global sci-fi itself. If Warning from Space was about listening, The Mysterians was about resisting. Both ideas would become Hollywood staples. Today, The Mysterians still feels like a colorful comic book come to life, but don't mistake it for fluff. It was a blueprint, loud, strange, and strangely prophetic. Battle in Outer Space, 1959. Before Star Wars ever blasted into theaters, Japan had already staged an intergalactic showdown. Battle in Outer Space, directed by Ishiro Honda in 1959, was a direct follow-up to the Mysterians, and it took the alien invasion story from Earth's surface to the cold void above. Imagine sleek rocket ships, gravity beams pulling tanks into the sky, and miniature battles that made audiences feel like they were staring into the future. The film's setup feels oddly familiar. A sinister alien force, known as the Natal, launches attacks on Earth, first disabling satellites, then escalating into full-scale war. Earth unites, sending astronauts aboard futuristic crafts to face them head-on. Sound like Independence Day or even Armageddon decades later. That's because Battle in Outer Space pioneered the global unity against a cosmic enemy theme long before Hollywood made billions off it. Visually, it was stunning. Miniature models of rockets soared through space, while laser beams, primitive by today's standards, lit up the dark skies. These effects were handled by the legendary Eiji Tsuburaya, who later became known as the godfather of special effects in Japanese cinema. His model work gave audiences something they'd never seen before: detailed depictions of space warfare on a grand scale. What made the film more than just spectacle was its timing. Released during the space race, it wasn't just about aliens. It was about human ambition and the fear of technological escalation. The idea that Earth's future depended on cooperation rather than competition was radical in 1959, when Cold War tensions were sky high. Hollywood took those ideas and turned them into spectacle-heavy franchises. From Star Wars' galactic dogfights to Independence Day's coordinated counterattack, the fingerprints of Battle in Outer Space are everywhere. It may not have had Hollywood polish, but it had vision. And sometimes, vision is enough to inspire generations of filmmakers. Battle in Outer Space wasn't just a movie. It was a prophecy of how science fiction would dominate cinema. The Human Vapor, 1960. What happens when science gifts a man the power to dissolve into mist? The Human Vapor, directed by Ishiro Honda in 1960, answers that question with a mix of horror, tragedy, and moral fable. Forget giant creatures. This was intimate science fiction, closer to Frankenstein than Godzilla. It told the story of Mizuno, a mild-mannered man who becomes the subject of a dangerous experiment. The result? He can turn his body into vapor, slipping through walls and vanishing into thin air. But instead of becoming a superhero, Mizuno spirals into obsession. Using his powers, he robs banks to fund a dancer he adores, believing he's securing a better future for her. The twist is that his love is unrequited, and the more he pushes, the more destructive he becomes. The Human Vapor isn't just about science gone wrong, it's about loneliness, unfulfilled desire, and the dangers of confusing obsession with purpose. Visually, the effects were ingenious. Smoke machines, clever editing, and double exposure created the illusion of a man dissipating into mist. For audiences in 1960, it was eerie, even haunting. You can see its echoes in later Hollywood projects like The Invisible Man, or even Marvel's take on intangible characters. The idea of a villain or anti-hero who can vanish into vapor started right here. What makes the Human Vapor stick is its sadness. Mizuno isn't portrayed as purely evil. He's human, desperate, misguided, and ultimately doomed by his own choices. That moral grayness was unusual at the time, especially in genre films. Hollywood later embraced this complexity in sympathetic villains, but Honda was already experimenting with it. The Human Vapor may not have spawned a franchise, but it proved that Japanese sci-fi could be small, emotional, and deeply human. It whispered where kaiju films roared, and sometimes whispers leave the deepest scars. Dogora, 1964. A monster from space that eats carbon, it sounds absurd until you see it on screen. Dogora, directed by Ishiro Honda in 1964, is one of the strangest yet most fascinating entries in Japanese sci-fi. Instead of humanoid aliens or rampaging kaiju, the threat here is a giant, jellyfish-like creature that drifts through the skies, absorbing carbon to sustain itself. Coal, diamonds, anything carbon-based, Dogora consumes it all. At first glance, Dogora feels like a pure monster flick, but look closer and it's a sharp metaphor. In an age of rapid industrial growth, Japan was facing questions about consumption and greed. What better way to illustrate the dangers of unchecked hunger than a creature literally devouring the Earth's resources? Visually, Dogora was unlike anything audiences had seen. Instead of stomping through miniature cities, it floated gracefully in the clouds, rendered through surreal special effects that gave it an almost hypnotic presence. Watching it hover over landscapes, dissolving its targets with eerie calm, was unsettling precisely because it wasn't violent in the traditional sense. It was inevitable, unstoppable. Hollywood noticed. The idea of amorphous, unkillable entities became a recurring theme in later science fiction. You can draw a direct line from Dogora to films like The Blob, The Mist, or even aspects of Ghostbusters with its strange, floating phantoms. The concept of a threat you can't punch, reason with, or trap owes a lot to this Japanese original. What makes Dogora especially memorable is its mix of crime, caper, and sci-fi. Alongside the monster's attacks, there's a subplot involving jewel thieves who find themselves caught in the chaos when Dogora goes after their diamonds. It's a bizarre tonal blend, but it works, adding a layer of human greed to mirror the creature's insatiable appetite. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it, but Dogora has since earned cult respect as one of Toho's most imaginative experiments. It may not roar like Godzilla or soar like Rodan, but it doesn't need to. Dogora drifts silently, consuming everything in its path. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't angry, they're just hungry. Latitude 01969. Imagine a superhero movie decades before Marvel, only it came from Japan, not Hollywood. Latitude 0, directed by Ishiro Honda in 1969, was a wild blend of pulp adventure, comic book energy, and sci-fi fantasy. At its center is the Alpha, a golden submarine captained by the heroic Craig Mackenzie, who wages war against a mad scientist bent on creating mutant creatures and world chaos. From the first scene, Latitude 0 feels like a Saturday morning cartoon brought to life. Bright costumes, flamboyant villains, and imaginative gadgets fill the screen. The Alpha submarine itself is a marvel, sleek, futuristic, and armed with technology that made James Bond's gadgets look outdated. Add to that mutant Batmen, brain-swapping experiments, and volcanic layers, and you've got a movie that doesn't just swing for the fences, it blasts straight into the stratosphere. What's especially interesting is how this film blurred East and West. Produced as a Japanese-American co-production, it starred Joseph Cotten and Cesar Romero alongside Japanese actors. This cross-cultural mix gave it a unique flavor, almost predicting the way Hollywood would later market blockbusters globally. Hollywood eventually caught on to this formula. Eccentric villains, high-tech bases, and team-driven adventures. You can see Latitude 0's fingerprints in everything from campy superhero films of the 70 seconds to modern Marvel spectacles. It wasn't afraid to be colorful, bizarre, or over the top. And that courage to embrace the fantastical without apology is exactly what kept audiences hooked. Though not a hit in its time, Latitude 0 has since gained cult status as a proto-superhero film. It dared to dream big at a time when science fiction was usually grim or grounded. If the Mysterians was about fear of outsiders, Latitude 0 was about swashbuckling fun in a world of endless possibilities. Genocide 1968. What if the real threat wasn't monsters or aliens, but insects? Genocide, also known as War of the Insects, is a 1968 oddity directed by Kazue Nihonmatsu, and it might just be one of the most unnerving Japanese sci-fi films ever made. The premise sounds simple. Swarms of insects begin attacking humanity. But beneath the bug invasion is a story about paranoia, war, and humanity's own destructive tendencies. Set during the height of nuclear anxiety, Genocide opens with a U.S. military plane crashing near a remote island. On board, a deadly cargo that could spark catastrophe. As soldiers and locals investigate, swarms of insects begin acting with terrifying precision, attacking humans in organized waves. At first, it looks like a natural disaster. Then comes the revelation. Something or someone may be guiding them. The imagery is unforgettable. Clouds of crawling creatures overwhelm soldiers. Close-ups of ants, bees, and beetles create a feeling of suffocating dread. And unlike kaiju films, where the threat is one giant monster, Genocide reminds viewers that countless tiny foes can be just as terrifying. You can see the influence later in Hollywood's obsession with Nature Strikes Back, movies like Phase 4, Arachnophobia, and even Echoes in the Mist. What makes Genocide fascinating is its bleakness. It doesn't treat insects as random pests, but as a reflection of humanity's own violence. The characters bicker, plot, and betray one another while the swarms grow deadlier. The message is sharp. Maybe the planet is fighting back. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. It was too grim for mainstream audiences and too strange for casual viewers. But in retrospect, Genocide feels like a warning shot, a film that anticipated eco-horror decades before Hollywood made it trendy. Forget giant lizards or flying beasts. Genocide said the tiniest creatures could bring us down, and that fear has never gone away. The Manster 1959. A man grows a second head, and Hollywood never forgot it. The Manster, released in 1959, was a Japanese-American co-production that leaned heavily into body horror long before the term existed. It tells the story of Larry Stanford, an American journalist in Tokyo, who becomes the unwilling subject of a scientist's experiments. The result? A grotesque mutation that causes a second head to sprout from his shoulder. The transformation scenes were shocking for the time. Makeup effects showed skin bubbling, bones cracking, and eventually the horrifying reveal of a second snarling face. The film's marketing leaned into this. Two heads terror, twice the fear. It may sound pulpy now, but in the late 50 seconds, this imagery was nightmare fuel. But the Manster wasn't just a cheap gimmick. It carried undertones about identity, duality, and losing control of oneself. Larry starts off as a confident professional, but spirals as the mutation consumes him. By the climax, he's no longer one man, but two competing entities, battling for dominance inside the same body. That idea, that the real horror lies in losing your own humanity, echoed for decades in films like The Fly and even Venom. What makes the Manster stand out is its cross-cultural DNA. Made for both Japanese and American audiences, it bridged East and West, delivering a uniquely hybrid style of horror sci-fi. And while critics brushed it off as a B-movie, it gained a loyal cult following. Clips from it resurfaced in documentaries about horror's history, and even modern filmmakers cite it as an early influence in visualizing transformation on screen. The Manster is proof that sometimes the strangest experiments create the most lasting images. Hollywood eventually refined body horror with bigger budgets, but this little film from 1959 planted the seed. One man, two heads, endless nightmares. Gamera vs. Guiron, 1969. Sometimes the strangest films leave the biggest legacy. Gamera vs. Guiron, released in 1969, is one of the wildest entries in the long-running Gamera series. While Godzilla was tackling weighty themes about nuclear power and destruction, Gamera leaned into being the friend of children. This particular movie took that reputation to surreal new levels, blending kaiju chaos with outer space adventure. The story follows two curious boys who stumble upon a spaceship and end up transported to a distant planet. Waiting for them is guiron, a monster that looks like a giant reptile with a colossal blade for a head. His primary attack? Slicing enemies into pieces with terrifying precision. The design was so bizarre it was almost cartoonish, but that only made it more memorable. Gamera, of course, arrives to battle Guiron in a series of over-the-top fight sequences that are equal parts brutal and absurd. What makes this film so important isn't just its outrageous monster design, but its willingness to embrace camp. Scenes of alien women scheming, children outsmarting adults, and kaiju wrestling matches bordered on parody, but they gave the film a personality all its own. Hollywood later tapped into this same so-bad-it's-good energy with cult classics like Flash Gordon and even the more playful moments in Guardians of the Galaxy. For years, Gamera vs. Guiron was mocked for its cheap effects and wild storyline, but over time, it became a cult favorite. Its unapologetic weirdness gave it staying power, especially among fans who love their sci-fi unfiltered and a little ridiculous. The influence is subtle but real. Modern blockbusters often inject humor and self-awareness into cosmic battles, and Gamera was doing that decades earlier. This isn't the polished face of Japanese sci-fi, it's the punk rock cousin. Messy, loud, and unforgettable. Time of the Apes 1974. Before Planet of the Apes sequels dominated theaters, Japan had its own simian saga. Time of the Apes began as a television series in the early 70 seconds, but was stitched together into a feature-length film for international audiences in 1974. What emerged was a surreal, low-budget epic that dropped children and scientists into a future ruled by intelligent apes. The setup is pure pulp. A group of people are cryogenically frozen after a laboratory accident. When they awaken, they discover the world is controlled by humanoid apes who see humans as dangerous relics. Sound familiar? It should, because the parallels to Hollywood's Planet of the Apes franchise are undeniable. What makes Time of the Apes fascinating is how it blends adventure serial tropes with Japanese sci-fi aesthetics. The ape costumes may not have rivaled Hollywood's makeup, but they carried a strange charm. The futuristic sets, though often recycled from other productions, added a surreal quality, making the whole film feel like a dream. For Western audiences, the movie became most famous after it was lampooned on Mystery Science Theater 3000, where its odd dubbing and clunky editing turned it into comedy gold. But if you look past the camp, you'll see an earnest attempt to grapple with big themes. What happens when humanity loses its place at the top, and how do we define civilization when roles are reversed? Time of the Apes might not have had the polish or cultural weight of its Hollywood counterpart, but it showcased Japan's willingness to experiment with bold, unusual visions. It was part satire, part cautionary tale, and all strange. And sometimes, strange is what keeps a film alive long after critics forget it. Message from Space 1978. When Star Wars became a global phenomenon, Japan fired back with its own cosmic adventure. Message from Space, released in 1978 and directed by Kinji Fukasaku, was one of the boldest attempts to ride the new wave of space opera mania. And while critics dismissed it as a shameless imitation, today it feels like a vibrant, imaginative oddity that pushed boundaries Hollywood didn't dare touch. The premise is simple but mythic. A dying planet sends out glowing seeds across the galaxy, searching for heroes who will rise to defend its people from tyranny. Those seeds find their way to a ragtag group of misfits, warriors, rebels, and adventurers who must unite against a ruthless empire. If that sounds like Star Wars, it's because the parallels are obvious. But Message from Space wasn't just copying, it was remixing the formula with its own Japanese flair. Visually, the film was a spectacle. Lavish costumes, flamboyant set designs, and over-the-top battles gave it a comic book energy. The space battles may not have matched George Lucas's cutting-edge effects, but they carried a wild, colorful intensity. Critics at the time sneered, but audiences in Japan flocked to see it, making it a cult favorite. Hollywood eventually borrowed some of its spirit, especially the idea of mixing samurai-style honor with galactic adventure. George Lucas himself acknowledged how Japanese cinema shaped his vision, and Message from Space feels like a mirror held up to that influence, Japan taking back the narrative and reshaping it for its own audience. Over the years, the movie has been re-evaluated as more than just a knockoff. Its energy, creativity, and fearless embrace of camp give it staying power. It may not have changed the world like Star Wars, but it proved Japan could play in the same sandbox and sometimes throw in ideas even wilder than Hollywood dared. Sayonara Jupiter 1984. When the space race hype slowed, Japan imagined the ultimate disaster in the cosmos. Sayonara Jupiter, directed by Koji Hashimoto in 1984, was a big-budget Japanese space opera that tried to merge hard science with sweeping spectacle. While American audiences were caught up in Star Wars sequels, Japan dared to ask a bigger question. What if humanity had to stop a catastrophe involving Jupiter itself? The film follows Dr. Plane, A.G. Honda, a space engineer overseeing a mission to harness energy near Jupiter. But trouble comes fast. A black hole is discovered heading toward the solar system, and the only hope is to use Jupiter's massive gravity to alter its path. Sounds wild? It island. The visuals leap from vast starfields to futuristic space stations, and the sheer ambition is undeniable. This wasn't just ray guns and chases, it was about humanity's place in the cosmos. What makes Sayonara Jupiter fascinating is its tone. It's part disaster epic, part philosophical drama. Characters debate humanity's survival, whether colonizing space is progress or arrogance, and how fragile our future really island. It doesn't shy away from heavy themes like overpopulation, ecological collapse, and the fear that technology might save us, but also doom us. In other words, it's not just popcorn entertainment, it's a warning wrapped in spectacle. Hollywood never directly remade Sayonara Jupiter, but its DNA echoes in films like Armageddon, Deep Impact, and even Interstellar. The idea of humans trying to outwit cosmic forces while juggling moral dilemmas shows how ahead of its time this film was. Though critics were divided, some calling it ponderous, others praising its ambition, there's no denying it aimed for the stars when most were content to play in the sandbox. Today, Sayonara Jupiter remains a reminder that Japanese sci-fi wasn't afraid to think big. It may not have conquered the box office, but it dared to imagine humanity confronting the universe itself. And that kind of audacity is exactly what shaped the future of the genre worldwide. So there you have it, 12 forgotten Japanese sci-fi films that quietly changed the way Hollywood told its biggest stories. From floating jellyfish monsters to cosmic seeds of rebellion, these movies didn't just entertain, they rewired imagination itself. Which one surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts below, and if you love uncovering hidden cinema history, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the future of film always begins with its forgotten past.